This made me genuinely angry. Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to review what isn't only the most disappointing philosophy book I've ever ordered, it might also be, without a word of exaggeration, the worst philosophy book I have ever read, bar none. The book I'm reviewing is A Social History of Analytic Philosophy by Christoph Schuringa, and it was published by Verso. I have mixed feelings about Verso. Verso publishes a lot of good stuff, but their books are overpriced and their production values are terrible, like what you'd expect from a shitty construction paper coloring book from the 90s. But in terms of content, a lot of solid stuff. They've got stuff by Slavoj Žižek, stuff by Bifo Berardi, Jacques Rancière, Frederick Jameson, George Bataille, etc. Stuff you'd want to read, some stuff that you can only really get in English through them. That said, a lot of people like physical copies of books, so before we get into the meat of this and why this particular book makes me mad in terms of its content, in terms of the stuff that the author is responsible for, let's talk about the physical make of this monstrosity. Right off the bat, again, like all Verso books, this book is incredibly cheaply constructed. Just picking it up, you can feel how light and cheap this book is. The cover is paper textured to resemble cloth. The pages are a nasty and rough paper stock, and every time you open and close the book, you hear the swiftly decaying glue they used for the spine creak menacingly. That garbage ain't gonna hold for very long. The problem is a combination of very cheap materials and also the fact that they've glued a hardback book. When you glue a hardback book, the cover puts extra stress on the glue binding that wouldn't be present if the cover was flexible. Sometimes it's actually better to get the paperback. I'm mentioning this because a lot of people go, oh, hardback, because hardbacks look like classical, serious, luxurious things that would look impressive on your shelf. Here's the thing. The durability of a book comes down to more than just the material of the cover. When publishers put a glued binding in a hardcover book, they are trying to trick you into paying a premium for an extra strip of cardboard that will actually reduce the longevity of your book. It's a scummy practice, and for roughly $60 after shipping, Verso should be genuinely embarrassed by the quality of their product. This book is horribly constructed. For a comparison, one publisher I will always endorse is Zone Books. I'm not sponsored by Zone Books, even though I'd accept a sponsorship in a heartbeat. They're just that good. Zone Books sells high-quality academic texts with thick paper stock and sewn bindings that will last you many read-throughs for a little over half the price of the average book that Verso is putting out. This isn't just specific to this book. If you must get a physical copy of any book by Verso, I cannot stress enough, buy their paperback editions. They are cheaper and will literally last longer than this fake hardcover garbage. Publisher issues aside, this book by Christoph Schuringa made me extremely angry. It's an example of some of the most astonishingly bad scholarship I have seen in a text put out by an academic publisher. I mean, this book isn't just bad, it's not just flawed, it's less than worthless. Now, having said that, I want to be extremely clear. I did not go into this book wanting to hate it. Quite the opposite. Having never heard of Schuringa before this book was announced, from the moment it was brought to my attention by my viewers, I was extremely excited for it. The book is called A Social History of Analytic Philosophy. This sounds tremendously interesting, even important. A history of the sociological events and dynamics that gave rise to the emergence and success of analytic philosophy as a dominating culture within academic philosophy? Sign me up. That sounds amazing. So I pre-order it. The book's expensive, but it arrives at my door and I immediately go out to a cafe to start reading. From the very first sentence, the introduction is extremely promising. Quote, Analytic philosophy, today the hegemonic form of academic philosophy in the English-speaking world and beyond, tends to think of itself as removed from the changing scenes of history. It acts as if it were pursuing its questions from a vantage point situated nowhere in particular, unaffected by social and political reality. It thus operates as a tradition that managed to think of itself as no tradition at all. The treatment to which it is subjected in this book directly challenges this self-image by demonstrating how analytic philosophy is the product of, and has continued to be shaped by, the social world in which it finds itself. Unquote. This is an amazing start, and we have a clear and exciting objective. Schuringa is going to demonstrate how analytic philosophy was and is the product of a social world, and that against the pretenses of many analytic philosophers to be concerned only with the most universal truths, with external factors only acting as annoying interferences here and there, actually, Schuringa in this book promises to show that analytic philosophy is as affected by material conditions as everything else in society. He then goes on to explain that the book will be engaging in what he terms ideology critique. Quote, "Much of this book is engaged in ideology critique in line with a Marxist tradition. Ideology critique has often been thought to attribute an exaggerated status to the explanatory power of ideology, and to the material conditions that are in turn thought to be productive of that ideology. But no one is a mere mouthpiece of class interests, not even philosophers. A less crude form of ideology critique recognizes that no one is exempt from having class interests speak through them in what they do and say. Once it is recognized that analytic philosophy, like its cousins, behaviorism and neoclassical economics, serves to perpetuate a picture that is central to bourgeois liberal ideology, that of an inert realm of fact, simply given to the subject to be passively received, against which realm that subject stands as supposedly autonomous and spontaneous, it is seen that no passage in its history escapes ideology critical treatment." Unquote. So that's a mouthful, but basically Schuringa is telling us that he will be analyzing the history of analytic philosophy with class interests and ideology in mind, without reducing the subject of his study to being mere mouthpieces of a class, and he's going to tackle how analytic philosophy has acted as a means by which anti-colonial studies has itself been colonized. When I read this, I was, as they say in the vernacular, pumped. This sounded like a fantastic and nuanced approach to the history of philosophy through a materialist lens that is sorely wanting, and which would fill in some important historical gaps, certainly for me. So imagine my disappointment when I read Chapter 1 entitled Elements of Analytic Philosophy, and discovered that the so-called less crude form of ideology critique that Schuringa promises turned out to be a series of cherry-picked quotes in which famous philosophers, prior to the existence of analytic philosophy, endorsed empiricism, liberal democracy, and deference to the findings of science, thereby apparently marking themselves as somehow of a kind with analytic philosophy despite it not existing while they were working. His historical support for justifying these as elements of analytic philosophy are, frankly, pathetic. For example, on page 16, Schuringa writes that while, quote, "the continuity of analytic philosophy with empiricism liberalism across this brief alien abyss is not generally recognized by today's analytic philosophers, but it seemed obvious enough to A.J. Ayer when he wrote, in the opening words of his polemical and carefree logical positivist manifesto, Language, Truth, and Logic, that the views set out in that book derive from the doctrines of Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein, which are themselves the logical outcome of the empiricism of Berkeley and David Hume." Unquote. When I read this, I was like, what? See, there is literally nothing presented to connect these elements with analytic philosophy except that one philosopher thought his work vibes with that of older philosophers who were not analytic philosophers. To be clear, the problem is not that any of these statements that these things are elements of analytic philosophy are wrong. The problem is that Schuringa has relied entirely on the endorsement of one philosopher's book to avoid having to grapple with the methodological problem of delineating his subject. What is analytic philosophy? Defining analytic philosophy is a difficult problem, so how does Schuringa approach it? By giving us his word that, trust me guys, this is definitely what analytic philosophers think, because this one analytic philosopher said he derived his views from Russell and Wittgenstein in a book that didn't call what he derived from Russell and Wittgenstein analytic philosophy. Like, I'm sorry? Anyways, then we reach Chapter 2 entitled The Rebellion Against Idealism, in which we are given a bog-standard Wikipedia-level intellectual history. For example, in the whole introduction of Chapter 2, we learn that Russell, Moore, and Wittgenstein are intellectual forebears of analytic philosophy and helped to set up important bits of what was gestured at with cherry-picked quotes with no systematic analysis in the introduction, and Schuringa is careful to point out that all of these philosophers were rich. Bertrand Russell was rich. G.E. Moore was rich. Wittgenstein was rich. We also learned that Moore's most important legacy was a style of philosophical conversation in which people asked, "What do you mean a lot?" I want you to think about that for a second. Schuringa thinks it is noteworthy that philosophers around and after Moore asked, "What do you mean a lot?" Moore gravitates, Schuringa writes, toward the tendency of philosophy to give way to common sense, therefore showing just how deeply analytic philosophy could be implicated in the reproduction of the status quo. These two introductory pages literally exhaust all of the social history in this chapter. What follows is a rote account of who influenced who that is already surpassed by the aforementioned philosopher's entries on Wikipedia. Notice also the virtual absence of citations for any of these statements. Also, did I mention that Russell was rich, and that Wittgenstein was rich, and that Moore had a lot of money? I'm not objecting to the fact that these people's wealth is being mentioned. That would be an important part of a social history of analytic philosophy, as well as to a biographical history of Russell, Moore, and Wittgenstein. But Schuringa never does anything with this information. This important information about the economic situations of major movers and shakers in institutional philosophy are never put in the service of any actual analysis. It's just thrown in with virtually no explanatory commentary as to its significance, and for seemingly no other purpose than to identify these guys as the source of a problem, as the bad guys. And when Schuringa starts to address analytic philosophers directly, he gives us vague, overgeneralized, and more often than not, again, completely uncited claims. By the way, when I said that the history on offer here was Wikipedia tier, I'm not saying this rhetorically. In Chapter 6, Schuringa claims that analytic philosophers originated the term continental philosophy to label the post-Kantian philosophical tradition that analytic philosophy apparently circumvents, and his only citation for this is literally a Wikipedia page. This is embarrassing. Horrifically, however, this is a relative high point in the book, as throughout we are subjected to an endless series of historical claims with zero references at all to substantiate them. On page 49, we are told that Bertrand Russell waged a vociferous campaign against French philosopher Henri Bergson because he was, quote, enviably famous, irritatingly popular with women, and Jewish, unquote. We are given no citations for this. Schuringa just decided that Bertrand Russell was an anti-Semite, I guess. On page 53, we are told that Wittgenstein should not be taken to have any sympathies with Marxism because he was in fact a reactionary with a taste for Oswald Spengler. This seems like an important historical detail. I'm interested in it, at least, but we are given no citation for this. A few more examples. On page 44, we are told that Moore's open question argument, despite being a, quote, shockingly bad argument, unquote, is, quote, still treated with reverence by analytic philosophers. It is as if they cannot allow themselves to see that Moore really is saying, as he seems to be, that even if it has been accepted that X is defined as Y, we can still ask, but is X Y, unquote. No citation is given for this claim. Which analytic philosophers? Who are you talking about, Christoph? On page 156, we're told that, quote, if today analytic philosophers like to announce that the conflict with continental philosophy is over, things look like that to them because they have successfully colonized their other, unquote. Again, no citation. On page 164, we are told that, quote, there is a consensus among analytic philosophers that John Searle contributed to the analysis of the social world, unquote. Surprise, no citation. Page 177, quote, the linguistic project of first philosophy attributed by Dummett to Frege was gradually forgotten. Instead, the problem of meaning or aboutness became just another scholastic issue analytic philosophers worked on without being sure why, unquote. No citation. Do you think it might be important if you're going to say that analytic philosophers don't know why they're working on a problem that they're working on, that you specify which analytic philosophers, who on this earth you are referring to, Christoph? No citation. On page 194, we are told that, quote, in the eyes of many analytic philosophers, the purported problem of meaning only gained in seeming importance the more it became a self-standing concern, no longer apparently requiring anything to motivate it, unquote. No citation. We have no idea who he is talking about. I could do this for a while, but I think you get the point. Hey, don't you think it would be cool if in a social history of analytic philosophy we were given any kind of citation proving claims about predominant behaviors and attitudes among the majority of analytic philosophers? There's literally no social or materialist analysis here. There's no ideology critique for sure. There's just a poorly referenced gloss on the history of philosophy departments in English-speaking countries with uncited generalizations, innuendos and insinuations sprinkled in for spice, with no goddamn citations to back any of it up. Besides bad scholarship, there are things about this book that are just weird. and I mean weird. Some of it can just be put down to bad writing and a lack of good editing, like when on page 47 concerning Russell's affair with Lady Audeline, Schuringa writes that, quote, Russell, who struggled constantly to negotiate the intellectual and temperamental differences between them, was always trying to demonstrate that their views were the same even though they were not. Audeline was, for instance, religious, while Russell tended towards a strident atheism. When an acknowledgement of such differences was required, he diverted his energy into violently attacking her views. Faced with the prospect of a final separation, he told her of urges to commit suicide or else an unspecified sexual crime, unquote. This is very strangely worded and seems to imply that the urges to commit suicide or a sexual crime were not directed at Audeline by Bertrand Russell, which was in fact the case. This does not represent the source, and this is a rare case where Schuringa actually cites one, which is a biography by Ray Monk entitled Bertrand Russell, The Spirit of Solitude, which says very explicitly that this was a threat against Audeline personally. Quote, after a meeting with Audeline made painful and unsatisfying by her unwillingness to make love to him, Russell was in the depths of a suicidal depression, telling her that he had lost the spring of life and was weary of the world. I want to lay down my head and sleep, to be done with strife and the terrible hope of happiness. He was convinced, with some reason, that Audeline no longer loved him. Frankly, can you blame her? And that the last 2 months since his walking holiday in Dorset had inflicted upon their love a mortal wound. If I could face love without you, I would break. I shall try to live without you, since if you go on in the same course, it will soon be necessary. I feel that if we parted, little as I should intend it, the moment would come when in a sudden impulse I should put myself under a motor for the pleasure of feeling my backbone break. And if he avoided suicide, he told her, I should not avoid sexual crime from mere desperation. The horrible but unavoidable implication was that if Audeline did not submit to his demands for sex, he would either kill himself or commit rape. Unquote. Now, the PDF version of Schuringa's book appears to have corrected this sentence to read as follows, quote, when an acknowledgement of such differences was required, he diverted his energy into violently attacking her views. When she refused to have sex with him on a holiday in Lausanne, he threatened her with either suicide or rape, unquote. This lends credence to the idea that this book was simply poorly edited, which, again, is strange given that this book was endorsed for its quality by no less than Slavoj Žižek on the back cover. How did this pass quality control? This is terrible. Also, while fuck Bertrand Russell would appear to be a perfectly respectable subject matter for a book, this anecdote, taken with its interpretation from a single secondary source, has nothing whatsoever to do with establishing a social history of analytic philosophy. Schuringa, again, seems more interested in telling us lurid details about the activities of bad and privileged people who happen to be philosophers, rather than doing the thing he said he set out to do in the book, which is to give us a social history of analytic philosophy. Weirder is when the thinly veiled chips on Schuringa's shoulders start to bleed through the paper. He is positively sneering whenever he describes analytic philosophers asking questions like, what do you mean by that? For example, on page 27 we read that, quote, More himself never clarified what analysis was, but his followers, among them Susan Stebbing, Max Black, and John Wisdom, worked hard to do so. But his most important legacy was a certain style of philosophical discussion. It was highly conversational and relied heavily on the iterated deployment of the question, but what exactly do you mean? The general atmosphere was one of studied ignorance and incomprehension articulated by gasps of incredulity, unquote. On page 46, quote, the Bloomsbury Group's form of conversation, what exactly do you mean, was not just exercised by Moore himself for many years as he formed philosophers in the Cambridge mold, but persists to this day in the tutorials and seminars of analytic philosophy, unquote. I find it very weird that Schuringa acts as if asking clarifying questions were some sort of deviation from philosophy and not an essential part of it, not to mention a basic condition of communicating new and complex ideas clearly to strangers. Combined with his apparent inability to provide even historical evidence for the vast majority of claims made in this book, one might get the impression that Schuringa is haunted by some bad experience of having been asked a question by a colleague that he was not able to answer, and that he coped with it by deciding that such questions were a philosophical perversion of analytic philosophy. But I speculate. There's a lot more I could dig into, but frankly this book isn't worth it, so to end off, I want to talk about his chapter on how analytic philosophy colonized anti-colonial studies, because it is so bad it's funny. To get the expected out of the way, there is of course a dearth of citations. There are also citations that just don't make sense. On page 270, Schuringa refers to Catherine MacKinnon's impatience with speech act theory to an essay by Lorna Finlayson, called How to Screw Things with Words. Why would he use a secondary source by one philosopher as a citation for what amounts to a description of a different contemporaneous philosopher's psychological disposition? That's just a weird thing to do. There are also claims that are just bizarrely ignorant and/or confused. For example, on page 261, Schuringa makes the strange assertion that the so-called social turn in philosophy didn't actually involve a methodological turn. Quote, "The activity in these fields does not involve a methodological turn. Analytic philosophy has not itself turned social. The figures he mentions are analytic philosophers in a traditional mold, continuing methodologically as they were before, but now applying the methods and tools of analytic philosophy to subject areas that analytic philosophy had previously ignored." Unquote. Increasing the range of subject matter that philosophical tools can be brought to bear on or be sensitive to is literally a methodological change, not least of all in the frame of reference concerning what tools are appropriate for what subjects. He then claims that, quote, "The ideology of analytic philosophy is that of liberalism." Unquote. Again, no citation. He just says this. Without any argument or evidence, he has just decided that analytic philosophers are liberals, just by default. Lending some more credence to the suspicion that Schuringa is bitter about some pesky colleague asking him to explain what the hell he is talking about, this last chapter treats us to what I can only describe as nonsensical waffling whenever feminist philosophers deploy concepts from philosophy of language or try to define terms for analysis. He has a very bizarre ire for Sally Haslanger in particular. For example, in her 2023 Walter Benjamin lecture, Haslanger opened by discussing how she was an analytic metaphysician who had been transformed into a critical theorist through the influence of some colleagues. Schuringa responds to this by saying that, quote, "These informal remarks signaling the new amity between analytic philosophy and critical theory disguise the fact that in reality, Haslanger had not been transformed into a critical theorist at all. Instead, a Marxist tradition, having traveled to America, was being sold back to its inheritors, having suffered a reduction to the status of analytic philosophy." Unquote. Or, for another example, in response to a section in Resisting Reality by Haslanger in which she compares the category woman as a subordinated class with that of racialized groups as subordinated classes, Schuringa makes the bizarre response that, quote, "Such a schematism of oppression leaves out of account the actual social texture of how either misogyny or racialization work. In Haslanger's work, there is no actual philosophy of race to speak of, if that is thought to involve discussion of the history and reproduction of racialization in concrete terms." Unquote. What Schuringa even wants here or finds lacking is a mystery. Why would Haslanger have a positive philosophy of race outside of a discursive analysis when her project is explicitly concerned with deflating subordinating categories as ideologically derived? They aren't real. Schuringa then makes the disturbingly anti-intellectual, but nonetheless amusing claim that, quote, "It does not require special philosophical tools to discover that race is a social construct and that race is real. Activist work has always been well ahead of such evident truths, while analytic philosophers remain, at best, caught up in their careful recalibration. At worst, they threaten a regress into the conceptual space of Appia's father's house." Unquote. Again, who these analytic philosophers are that he's referring to is a mystery, but what a relief to learn that activists have seemingly by default figured out that race is a constructed fiction of oppression, and that therefore there isn't a problem with rampant, still to be unpacked, racist tendencies among even left-wing activists. What is the message here besides, don't ask questions and don't think too hard? In all seriousness, it really does seem like Schuringa is taking revenge in this book on some unnamed colleagues for asking him to explain his reasoning, and he couldn't. When he comments on a statement made by Haslanger engaging in self-criticism for some definitions of man and woman from an earlier essay on the grounds that, quote, "Although my view does not require that one have male genitalia to be a man or female genitalia to be a woman, it does require being subject to subordination/privilege that is linked by ideology to the local bodily markers of reproductive role. This is a mistake. Some women are prevented from presenting as women, and some men are prevented from presenting as men, and so do not meet the conditions I proposed." Unquote. Schuringa responds, quote, "The underlying problem with this is that analytic philosophy struggles to treat the people being discussed here and their lived experience as something other than counters in a game. Schematic formulae purporting to define man and woman in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions will not provide the requisite illumination." Unquote. It's all just very weird. Schuringa is irrationally offended by the idea of analyzing our language use. It is bizarre. The cherry on top for me is when, in the second to last page of the last chapter of what is supposedly, again, a social history of analytic philosophy, Schuringa writes this absolute gem. Quote, "When it comes to decolonizing the curriculum, analytic philosophers suddenly become oblivious to the difference between Western philosophy as a tradition and itself, analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy departments are to enrich themselves by incorporating into their curriculum other traditions. This denies what analytic philosophy elsewhere asserts, that it is not one tradition, a Western tradition, to be contrasted with other non-Western traditions, but itself living, breathing philosophy as such, transcending tradition." Unquote. What Schuringa is doing here is bizarre. He is conflating analytic philosophy departments incorporating other traditions into their curricula with analytic philosophy as such subordinating other traditions. The problem, obviously, is that philosophy departments aren't traditions. They're departments. They're institutions with campuses, staff, administrative jurisdiction over a given set of curricula. They could be completely taken over by adherents of radically different philosophical approaches at any time, and their status as analytic philosophy departments would not change. But Schuringa thinks a department, a set of buildings, programs, and a staff, is the same thing as a school of thought or a tradition. I mean, seriously. To be completely frank, the academic standards of this book were so bad that in the course of reading it, I actually forgot to notice the lack of any actual social history. When I read the words, social history of analytic philosophy, I expect to see information about how systemic or structural forces caused certain kinds of philosophers or topics to be sidelined or emphasized, privileged or written out. For example, the Women's Studies department at the university I graduated from was first established as part of a compromise when a grad student accused a staff member of sexual impropriety. Something like that is a really important piece of information if you want to understand the social history of a discipline, how patriarchal institutions were bent to accommodate disciplines and movements they were previously hostile or contemptuous towards, as a consequence of scandals directly arising from the sexism inherent to their culture that things like women's studies exist partially to combat. And so I had a bit of a moment when I was reading another wonderful review of Schuringa's book by Kiran Setia, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is a philosophy professor at MIT, entitled The Politics of Apoliticism, in which, after he similarly noted the lacking evidence and poor analysis in Schuringa's book, points out, rather more brutally than I think he intended, that, quote, "Schuringa makes fun of analytic philosophers for asking, with an air of snide superiority, 'Now what exactly do you mean by ugh?' This practice was alive and well in Oxford," he bemoans, "as late as 2007. I am sorry to say that requests for clarification are still a thing in analytic circles, and that I am about to issue one. What exactly does Schuringa mean when he says that he's engaged in ideology critique of analytic philosophy? He doesn't define terms explicitly, but I would think he must mean, at least, that he's exploring how liberal ideology affects what analytic philosophers study, or how they study it, in ways they fail to recognize. Questions that might uncover cryptic ideologies go unasked in Schuringa's book. Why was analytic philosophy so indifferent to the flowering of interest in race, gender, and sexuality that transformed the other humanities in the 1970s and 80s, for example?" Unquote. And when I read that, I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Why is a so-called social history of analytic philosophy that explicitly begins by declaring its intent to engage in ideology critique so consistently disinterested in tracing the role of ideology in determining what analytic philosophers included or excluded from their interests? The book is called A Social History of Analytic Philosophy. That should be the whole point. Well, after spending an ungodly amount of time crawling through Schuringa's sources, and if there's one advantage to Schuringa's book, it's that there are blessedly very few of those to deal with, I think I have an answer. Because first off, about this term ideology critique. It isn't really a thing, certainly not how Schuringa talks about it. Certainly, ideology is critiqued in Marxist thought, and the phrase ideology critique naturally occurs in Marxist writings and in non-Marxist writings. But as a technical term, despite being presented by Schuringa as if this was some regular terminology within Marxist theory, it isn't really something that even Marxist academics talk about as if it were some specific methodology all on its own with a pedigree. Ideology critique is literally just critique applied to ideology, and that can mean any number of things depending on who you're talking about. So while that phrase, ideology critique, occurs within Marxist writing, it's mostly an empty signifier that really any meaning could be tacked onto. And when it is done, when one is engaging in a critique of ideology, one is usually trying to do something like unpack how a certain conception of reality serves a certain social arrangement by entrenching a conception of the world and the place of humanity in it that entails that social arrangement's de facto necessity. Simply pointing out that so-and-so had a lot of money and was therefore probably aloof to the struggle of the poor or was a privileged bastard doesn't cut it. That's not critique. Based on my reading of his sources, what I'm pretty sure Schuringa has in fact done is just lift this term from a book called Resisting Reality by Sally Haslanger. And I was able to discover this again largely because he spends a ridiculous amount of space attacking Haslanger later in the book. We'll return to that in a moment, but this is how Haslanger talks about ideology critique in Resisting Reality. Quote, "Reflection on the terms used for description and evaluation will sometimes reveal that institutional critique needs to be supplemented by ideology critique. Ideology critique focuses on the conceptual and narrative frameworks that we employ in understanding and navigating the world, especially the social world." And then she clarifies, "Ideology critique disrupts conceptual dogmatism and extends this method further to other representational tools, capacities, and culturally mediated patterns of response. It raises questions about their aptness, what they capture, and importantly, what they leave out, distort, or obscure. On my view, ideology includes habits of thought, unconscious patterns of response, and inarticulate background assumptions. In this regard, my own use of the term is probably closer to Bourdieu's notion of habitus than either a Marxian concept of ideology or a Foucaultian notion of discourse," unquote. Haslanger is careful to take pains to distinguish her concept of ideology critique from a Marxist one. When she clarifies that ideology critique disrupts culturally mediated patterns of response, I think Schuringa read that and decided on that basis that pointing out the financial privilege of certain philosophical figureheads was basically the same as giving a critical account of how this conditioned their thought and that of the traditions they influenced through mere innuendo. Obviously, since these people are rich, they were clearly of the exploiting rather than the exploited classes, and therefore must have been dirty, rotten defenders of the status quo. By the way, look at how creepy Bertrand Russell was with his mistress. Like, what are we even doing here? This would explain at least why Schuringa was so emphatic in the beginning that his approach was going to be more nuanced and less crude than other forms of ideology critique, when he ultimately didn't do anything that approaches something that this term could meaningfully describe on anyone's terms. He didn't have in mind any specific methodological process when he said ideology critique. He just saw the phrase ideology critique in Haslanger's book, thought it looked good, and decided that when he was pointing out that Russell and Wittgenstein and Moore were rich, that's what he was doing. Or, alternatively, this book was written with AI assistance, which in present year is an active possibility. I mean, I'm just saying, this is the second book Schuringa has published this year, and the two have practically zero topical overlap. I also started reading the other book, by the way, on stream, Karl Marx and the Actualization of Philosophy, published by Cambridge no less. That's a lot of work for someone who very clearly doesn't like showing his. Also, by the way, the Marx book is very bad. Very bad. I want to be clear, the problems with this book are not in its conclusions. What defines an academic text over something else is not that it's right, it's that the academic text deploys some kinds of standards in its methodology and in how it justifies its claims, so that it is reliable, so that it provides a path for understanding how the author came to his conclusions, so that readers can actually assess whether they agree with his reasoning. Schuringa's book does not provide this. If he simply had conclusions that I disagreed with, I would say I disagree with his conclusions, and that would be that. It is so bad that I earnestly begin to suspect that large amounts of the research were done with AI, and then sources were occasionally found when Schuringa decided to take the trouble to give the thinnest, and I mean the thinnest appearance of having done any actual work. But it gets worse. This isn't just bad scholarship, it's been inexplicably getting major celebrity academic endorsements, as mentioned earlier by people as illustrious as Slavoj Žižek, who says on the back cover of Schuringa's book, and I quote, "Schuringa's book achieves the impossible. While it follows a clear line of interpretation, analytic philosophy is not politically neutral, but is deeply rooted in capitalist liberalism and its struggle against leftist engagement. It develops this line in a vast and complex narrative full of fascinating historical and personal details, from the Cambridge beginnings of analytic thought, Russell Moore, through the key role of analytic philosophy and McCarthyite purges, up to how the analytic approach was crucial in incorporating anti-colonial and feminist orientations into its liberal frame, Appia. Schuringa's book is unputdownable. Applied to it, this term is not a cliché, but a simple description of its effect on a reader," unquote. Like, what the hell? Given the ire that Žižek has received in recent years for his pandering to, among other things, anti-trans fear-mongering in the slop he publishes online, in his never-ending quest to bask in his celebrity among people with no actual interest in philosophy whatsoever, a part of me wonders if Schuringa's weird fixation on attacking feminist philosophers who dare to, gasp, define their terms, is the real driver behind Žižek's enthusiasm for this book. Or maybe he has a deal with Verso where he plugs the new releases. Who knows? It doesn't matter. The point is that this is being framed as a major academic accomplishment that people can rely on, that students can rely on, and so students are going to be able to cite this book as a reliable source, and professors are going to see that it is endorsed by major philosophers. There are no citations in this book for its major claims, most of which amount to general comments on what analytic philosophers do or think, with literally nothing but Schuringa's word to back it up. It is basically just slander. Again, even the way he talks about analytic philosophy departments makes no sense. He talks about departments like they're schools of thought. They aren't schools of thought, and philosophy departments are basically never named analytic philosophy departments. We had people in my server try to find any officially labeled analytic philosophy departments, and the only one we could find was at the Academy of the Czech Republic. So that's special. To be clear, I'm not staking much on saying this book was written by AI. I'm not even saying it was. All I'm saying is that Schuringa's citations are sparse and don't seem to bear any evidence of him actually spending time with any of the relevant material in a serious way. I say this as a YouTube video essayist. In the course of doing research for much less ambitious projects than the entire social history of a philosophical movement, hell, just for this book review, I ended up with way too many sources to include them all. The fact that a book of this scale has worse citations to back up its claims than Wikipedia, which Schuringa has the gall to cite for a historical claim in an academic text endorsed by Žižek of all people, is insane. So, how to conclude? I find this book to be so bad that its very existence is disturbing. By comparison, Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies seems nuanced and careful, and by the way, it is not. Christoph Schuringa's A Social History of Analytic Philosophy is not a social history at all. Rather, it is, at best, a thinly veiled, poorly referenced screed against, and you know what, I'll just say it, people who annoyed Schuringa personally in his time in academia. Probably by asking him to do what is an essential part of a philosopher's job and give justifications for his claims. His book does not give justifications for his claims. And, to be honest, I find its publication ominous. I think it signals an ominous descent of major academic publishers and public academics into endorsing and promulgating poorly researched, poorly cited slop, and then using internet celebrity to promote it among people who don't know better. I critique a lot of and complain about bad philosophy on YouTube on this channel all the time. This is significantly more disturbing than that. This is a major academic publisher presenting that same low level of scholarship as not just up to standard, but as an academic achievement. To end on a pleasant note, because this has been a very negative video, this is how Schuringa ends his book. The tradition of empiricism liberalism represented by Hume, continued by analytic philosophy, in spite of its ignorant self-image as just philosophy as such, rightly trembles at the wrath that might be unleashed by the powerful critical forces that its hegemony helps to keep suppressed. If you like this video and want to help me make more, please consider joining my Patreon for early access to future videos, scripts, audio files, and merch. And as always, thank you for listening, and take care.
What am I gonna do?
Netanyahu's... Benjamin Netanyahu's...
Top guy! What am I gonna do?